to the problems of the deficit and current borrowing. That in itself tells one a great deal. I think that it is important to be truthful about what has failed, about the origin and source of the difficulties in which we now find ourselves immersed. They are not really the problems of a functioning real economy, which thankfully still has some prospects of recovery. They're entirely the consequences of the joining together of totally irresponsible speculative gambling that passed as banking. I haven't the time to go into what supported that, but a kind of, if you like, a version of governance and a version of moral responsibility right across the professions that offers a stay in forever on accountancy, auditing, and a whole series of other professions, which before now were regarded as ones that had standards which could not be violated. I'm talking about the signing off of accounts. Again, in relation to the state failure. The state failure flows from the Secretary General of the Department of Finance of the day, right through to the Chairman of the Central Bank, on to the regulator, and so on. We must, at some stage, say to the public, this culture is over. We are moving into a new space of regulation and responsibility, of accountability and transparency. And indeed, it is very interesting that some of the statements made by Deputy Noonan earlier this morning, when in the course of his remarks he referred to simplistic notions of the right or the left. I want to say a word or two about that. It is simply a fact that the case for regulation with a light touch, a la former Minister McCreevy, or light regulation as it flows from the neoliberal people from the Chicago School, comes from the right. It is rare you get the case made for the left for, if you like, deregulation or such light regulation as makes the destruction of the banking system possible. There is a difference between the left and the right, whether Deputy Noonan acknowledges it or not. The left basically recognises the social, the case for redistribution, the cohesive power of redistribution towards establishing citizenship. The right, on the other hand, makes its case, whether we like it or not, from a kind of radical individualism. It usually expresses itself in the kind of Reaganomics of saying it's their money, let them decide how they spend it, and so forth. That is the origin of the disaster in which we find ourselves. An ugly, greedy, ostentatious, not very cultured kind of expenditure. And it's interesting when the right reacts. Let us take, for example, the Minister for State responsible for overseas development aid is present. I'm sure he will be as appalled as I was to read the suggestion in the Irish Times from someone who is a distinguished Irish entrepreneur and noted for his philanthropy, who suggests that we shouldn't pay a penny in overseas development aid until we had balanced our budget. A scandalous suggestion, totally ignorant of the damage that has been done to Ireland's reputation by speculative gamblers. But over on the other hand, what has in fact saved Irish reputation? It has been in the area of overseas development aid, of peacekeeping, and indeed the work of our writers and to those who have in fact put genius into what they have delivered as a version of Ireland abroad. The damage to Ireland, and which will take a long time to recover, has been by professional people without morals and bankers without ethics. Now, I want to say just one last few words about it, because we're often asked from where, in fact, what was Labour suggesting? The argument that is just now, which in fact Deputy Rabbit has addressed attention to, is addressed, for example, at a recent seminar from the Policy Institute at Trinity College Dublin, when they launched report number 24, Ireland's Tax Expenditure System, International Comparisons and a Reform Agenda, which included Dr. Michael Collins from the Department of Economics at Trinity College. And anyone who looks at that will knows a simple conclusion that arises there, and that is the estimate of the annual cost of Ireland's tax expenditures. For example, in relation to a point in interruption from Deputy Hanifin about, if you like, the property-related tax expenditures that have been discontinued. The fact is that because they are contracted for a number of years, the cost in tax foregone will continue for a number of years. And yes, there was a choice. You could have, for example, closed them down immediately. You could have said that for the period until we get past 2015, no benefit shall accrue. You could do all of that. It is also a fact in relation to the total cost of leaving the blind intact leaving in people widows intact, and leaving those, for example, carers and dependents within families, it would have cost you 90 million. Now, you really must ask yourself the question before one's sensitivities start firing on all cylinders about how Republican it is to let the blind, to let the people who are in invalidity, to let people who are dependent and let carers, in fact, take the consequence of actions that were overwhelmingly leaned upon by those who were involved in the banking sector. But also, in relation to that, over in the practical side of things in relation to it, for example, in relation to the estimated cost, you'll find them in Table 2 of the Policy Institute document to which I have referred. In fact, people like to quote the OECD. I've been a critic myself of the OECD, of the cost of the top 10 tax expenditures as a percentage of GDP, are in Table 4 of the Trinity paper to which I've referred. It's interesting that the United Kingdom, as a percentage of GDP, has 8.651, but Ireland is a close follower, more than Canada. We are at 5.642. So you therefore look, if you like, at the different kind of tax expenditures or tax forgone and what it does to your general structure of tax, and you'll find that that is where one might have in fact begun. I think that I quote, for example, from the OECD in its 2010 paper, aspects of tax expenditures can cause the resulting complexity of the whole to exceed the sum of the complexity of the parts, in public perception as well as reality. As legal provisions, regulations, instructions and forms are piled upon one another, the body of tax wisdom needed to navigate the system can grow beyond the capacity of many non-experts. The marginal added provisions, even if they do not apply to a particular taxpayer, obscure that taxpayer's field of vision of what he or she needs to know. From a simple systems perspective, the potential interactions among additional tax expenditures could grow geometrically as more are added. And they give the example in the Trinity paper of the Irish seed capital system, in which an unemployed taxpayer trying to set up a self-employed, I quote them, requires navigation skills to chart 52 pages of complex legislation. Now, the actual reality of it all there was, if you wanted to say, look, we are in a tough place, why not then look at the place from which the great defects in the structure of tax and the economy began? The people who had been taking the benefits. I want to say, because I have such little time, yes, let me go back to the consequences of taking, for example, €8 off the meagre amount that a blind pension gets. The way you judge that is you look at the consequence of taking that proportion out of their disposable income. I said on radio this morning that when Deputy Minister Keeve was speaking, the issue is that every cent on these low incomes is accounted for. You equally go across in relation to the blind pension, and you take €8 off there. It is not the sum of money of the €8 that counts, but what it means as a proportion of their disposable income to live. And then you place it side by side with the additional costs. And then you turn to the person who is a dependent person in the house. Now, I finished then by saying this. I watched Minister Linehan, Minister for Finance, respond to these kind of arguments made by people like myself. And he turns over and he says, look at those small number of people who are paying most of the tax. Let him realize once and for all, they are paying it because they are able to pay it, and because they're in a position to pay the tax, and stop this nonsense that they are a precious group of people whose sensitivities are so great that they can't be asked to pay more. The other side of it is, as the Trinity paper shows, they have a large raft of loopholes, and they have hundreds of quasi-moral professionals advising them on how to milk them. And it is not the people on the blind pension or on invalidity, or the people who are on the minimum wage, or any of the people who are below now going to be dragged into the tax net who've enjoyed all of these perks. It is that group of people. And they were the people who dined and wined with, for example, the bankers who were sending out messages to the public saying you are under-borrowed. So I say now, if we are to go forward then, let's just hear it. We've been asked to say in the Labour Party where we stand, but let's hear it from the two larger parties either. Is it that you want to go back to that space from 2000 on from which you departed? Or are you willing to move to a new space in which you'll have new structures, new versions of professional accountability, eliminating different kind of tax concessions and so on? We'll answer that question for you. That's what's in our publications. But let's hear it from yourselves when you reply to the debate.
Kathleen Lynch.